My name is Ruby Scott. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, dependable, the one who answers messages, the one who remembers birthdays, forms, allergies, and old grudges that everyone else pretends they've forgotten. I've never been the loud one in the room. I don't argue to be seen, and I don't perform my pain for sympathy. People often mistake that for softness. Or worse, they assume it means I'll always be available, always understanding, always there to clean up the emotional spill after everyone else has left the table. If you met me casually, you'd probably think I live a simple, uneventful life. I work, I show up, I keep things running quietly in the background. I've learned that when you do that long enough, people stop seeing you and start seeing a function, a role, something useful, but replaceable. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or humiliating them. There are no villains here in the dramatic sense, just patterns, expectations, and a silence that went on far longer than it should have. What happened unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, until one moment forced everything into focus. The title might sound dramatic. My family used me as the emergency contact, then blocked my number. That sentence alone carries a lot of weight. And I want to be clear, this isn't a story built on shock. It's built on accumulation, on the quiet math of years spent being convenient, on what happens when people assume access without accountability. There's a moment later, one phone call, that changes how I see everything. The hospital called anyway. Not because I demanded anything, not because I pushed, but because reality doesn't care about emotional shortcuts people take when they think someone will always be there, no matter how they're treated. What you'll hear over the next hour is an honest account of how I went from being invisible to being essential, to choosing something different without raising my voice. It's about restraint, about boundaries that arrive without announcements, about what quiet dominance actually looks like when it isn't performative. I'm sharing this not to ask you to take sides, but to offer clarity for anyone who has ever been the reliable one and wondered when reliability quietly turned into entitlement. As you listen, I'd invite you to ask yourself one gentle question. Have you ever been needed deeply, but valued conditionally? For a long time, I didn't have a title in my family, not a real one anyway. I wasn't the successful one, or the difficult one, or even the funny one. I existed somewhere quieter than that. I was the one people defaulted to. If something needed organizing, I handled it. If someone forgot a detail, I remembered. If there was tension in the room, I softened it without anyone noticing I'd done so. I was the person whose name got written down on forms because someone had to be listed, and I was convenient. At first, that role felt harmless, even honorable. I told myself that every family has a stabilizer, and maybe that was me. I was good at it. I liked knowing things were taken care of. I liked being competent in a way that didn't require applause. But competence, when left unacknowledged long enough, becomes assumed. I noticed early on that my presence wasn't required unless something went wrong. Family gatherings didn't pause if I arrived late. Decisions were made without my input, even when they affected me directly. When I spoke, people listened politely, but not attentively, as if my words were background music rather than information. No one was cruel about it. That's important. There were no raised voices, no insults, just a consistent pattern of me being adjacent to importance, never at the center of it. I was the emergency contact on more than one form, not because I was closest emotionally, but because I was reliable. Because I answered my phone. Because I didn't ask follow-up questions that made people uncomfortable. If you'd asked my family how they saw me, they would have said kind things. She's responsible. She's low maintenance. She doesn't need much. Those phrases sound complimentary until you realize what they leave out. They leave out care. Somewhere along the way, I became the person who didn't need checking in on. The one who was assumed to be fine. The one whose silence meant stability, not absence. I remember one holiday in particular. Everyone was talking over each other, plans changing mid-sentence, mild chaos humming through the room. Someone asked who had the paperwork for an ongoing insurance issue. Without looking at me, someone else said, "Ruby probably has it." They were right. I did. Folded neatly in my bag. No one said thank you. No one asked how I'd gotten it. The conversation just moved on. Moments like that accumulate quietly. They don't hurt all at once. They settle in slowly, like dust on shelves no one thinks to clean because they don't notice it's there. I told myself I was imagining things, that this was adulthood, that not everyone needs to be fussed over to feel loved. I had a job, a routine, a life that worked on paper. So I minimized the ache of being peripheral in the one place that was supposed to feel unconditional. What I didn't realize then was that being the dependable one came with an invisible trade-off. You're valued for what you provide, not for who you are. And as long as the provider continues, no one thinks to ask if it costs you anything. I didn't demand space. I didn't correct assumptions. I filled in the gaps and told myself that maturity meant not needing reassurance. But there's a difference between independence and erasure. At that point in my life, I believed that if I stayed calm, stayed useful, stayed available, things would eventually balance out. That people would notice the quiet labor and adjust accordingly. I didn't yet understand that systems, familial or otherwise, rarely change unless something interrupts them. And I was very good at not interrupting. The first time I felt it wasn't dramatic. That's what made it easy to dismiss. It happened over something almost embarrassingly minor. A missed message. A group chat that moved on without me. I had been at work, phone on silent, doing exactly what everyone expected me to do. Handle responsibility without complaint. By the time I checked my phone, plans had already been finalized. A weekend gathering. Travel times. Who was bringing what? My name appeared only once, tagged next to a task, not an invitation. Ruby can handle the logistics. No one asked if I was available. No one asked if I even wanted to come. When I gently pointed it out, "Hey, I just saw this, am I still included?" The response came back quickly and cheerfully. "Of course. We just assumed you'd be fine with it." Fine. That word again. It carried an unspoken meaning. You don't need to be asked. I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, just a subtle recalibration. A realization that my presence was no longer something to be invited. It was something to be deployed. At the gathering itself, nothing was overtly wrong. People hugged me, smiled, and thanked me for bringing the documents and coordinating schedules. Someone joked that I was basically the family's admin department. Everyone laughed, including me. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed in public. They happen internally, quietly, while you're still smiling. Later that evening, as I was loading dishes into the sink, again without being asked, I noticed how seamlessly the role had settled onto my shoulders. Like everyone else had agreed on something I'd never been consulted about. I told myself not to overthink it. Families fall into habits. Someone has to do the boring parts. I was good at the boring parts, but once you notice a pattern, you can't unsee it. After that, it kept happening. Not just with plans, but with information. Decisions were made, assuming I'd be okay. Changes communicated after the fact. My input was requested only when it was needed to fix something, not when it could shape an outcome. Each instance was small enough to be defensible. Together, they formed something heavier. I mentioned it once, casually, to a relative I trusted. They waved it off with a laugh. "That's just how you are, Ruby. You're the capable one. Take it as a compliment." And I did, or at least I pretended to. What I didn't say out loud was that being seen as capable shouldn't mean being bypassed. That competence isn't consent. Assuming someone will always adapt is a quiet way of never adapting yourself. But I stayed quiet. I always did. Because pushing back felt like making a fuss. And I had learned early that fuss-making made people uncomfortable. So I smoothed things over, both externally and inside myself. Still, something had shifted, just enough to register. Like a hairline crack, you only notice it when the light hits it at the right angle. I didn't confront anyone, I didn't change my behavior, I just started paying attention. And attention, once turned on, doesn't turn off easily. Once something becomes familiar, it stops feeling wrong. That's how normalization works. Not with a loud announcement, but with repetition. After that first missed invitation, there were more moments, each one small enough to explain away. A call returned late, a message ignored until it was convenient. Plans adjusted without checking if they conflicted with mine. When I noticed, I'd hear the same refrains. "We didn't think you'd mind. You're so flexible. You're always so understanding." They said it with warmth, even affection, which made it harder to name what was happening without sounding ungrateful. So I did what I'd always done. I rationalized it. I told myself they were busy, that no one means to exclude anyone else, that adulthood comes with blurred boundaries and dropped balls. I reminded myself that no one was being intentionally hurtful, and that intention mattered more than impact. I became very good at that mental gymnastics. When someone forgot to loop me in, I filled in the gap. When information arrived late, I adjusted. When my contributions went unacknowledged, I told myself recognition wasn't the point. I wasn't doing it for praise. I was doing it because it needed to be done. But something subtle was happening beneath that reasoning. Every time I adapted without comment, the expectations solidified. My flexibility became a given. My silence became confirmation. I noticed that when others set boundaries, they were respected. When I didn't, it was interpreted as limitless availability. There was one afternoon that crystallized it for me. A relative called in a panic. Paperwork had been mishandled, deadlines missed. I stayed late at work to help fix it, walked them through every step, sent follow-up emails, and made sure nothing fell through the cracks. At the end of the call, they sighed in relief and said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." It was meant as gratitude. It landed like a weight. Because what they meant was, we rely on you to absorb this so we don't have to change. No one asked if it disrupted my evening. No one asked how often this happened. The crisis was solved, and that was the end of it. I started noticing how rarely anyone asked how I was doing. Really doing. Conversations skimmed the surface. Updates were transactional. If I didn't volunteer information, no one dug for it. I told myself I preferred it that way. That privacy was a form of peace. That not being the emotional center spared me drama. But there's a difference between peace and absence. Slowly, I began to understand that I had been quietly trained, by repetition, not decree, to occupy a very specific place. One where I was dependable but peripheral. Necessary but not nurtured. And the most unsettling part was this. I had participated in it, by staying agreeable, by not naming discomfort, by equating maturity with endurance. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't plotting anything. I was just tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. And still I stayed, because leaving a role you've been praised for feels riskier than staying in one that diminishes you. Because being the good one becomes part of your identity, even when it costs you quietly. At that stage, I truly believed that if I just held on, if I stayed kind, stayed helpful, stayed calm, things would eventually even out. That respect would catch up to effort. I didn't know yet that respect doesn't arrive on its own. It has to be required. It didn't happen all at once. No one sat me down and told me who I was supposed to be. The role emerged the way these things usually do, through repetition, assumption, and my own compliance. I was the reliable one, the backup plan, the quiet constant. When something needed to be remembered, it was probably in Ruby's notes. When someone else dropped the ball, I was looped in to steady things. When emotions ran high, I was expected to be neutral, calming, and reasonable. No one asked if I wanted that role. They just noticed that I performed it well. I realized one day that I was being spoken about more often than I was being spoken to. Decisions were framed around what I would handle or be okay with, not what I thought or felt. It was subtle but consistent. If I was quiet in a conversation, it wasn't taken as contemplation. It was taken as agreement. If I didn't object, it meant yes. If I did object carefully, it was treated as a surprise, almost an inconvenience. I remember suggesting an alternative plan once. Nothing radical, just a different approach to handling a family matter. The room went quiet for a second. Then someone said lightly, "That's not really your lane, Ruby. You're better at the follow-through." Everyone laughed, again including me. That laugh did more to lock the role in place than any argument could have, because roles don't need enforcement when the person inside them cooperates. I started noticing how often my own needs were framed as secondary by default. Scheduling conflicts were resolved around others' priorities. My time was flexible. Theirs was fixed. If something clashed, the assumption was that I would adjust, and I usually did. Part of me believed this was what adulthood looked like, choosing harmony over ego, responsibility over recognition. I prided myself on not being difficult, but there's a cost to being low friction for everyone else. You become frictionless enough to be moved without resistance. I was trusted with sensitive information, but not included in meaningful decisions. Trusted to fix things, but not to shape them. Trusted to show up, but not to be centered. And because I rarely complained, the role hardened. The more I handled, the more there was to handle. The more I absorbed, the less anyone noticed the weight. People don't see what you carry well. What surprised me most was how natural it felt, to them and to me. I had internalized the idea that my value was tied to how little I asked for. That strength meant self-containment. That being easy to rely on was the same as being respected. It took me a long time to see that those things are not the same. By the time I recognized the role clearly, it was already established, expected, comfortable, for everyone except me. And still I didn't confront it, because naming a role risks losing it. And when you've built your identity around being needed, the idea of not being needed at all feels terrifying. So I stayed. I performed. I smiled. And somewhere beneath that, something began to loosen. Not outwardly, but internally. A quiet awareness that this arrangement only worked because I allowed it to. I just didn't yet know what I was going to do with that awareness. The shift didn't come from an argument. No one said anything unkind. There was no breaking point that announced itself as one. It came on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary place, doing something I'd done dozens of times before. I was sitting at my kitchen table, paperwork spread out in front of me, medical forms this time. Not mine, someone else's. I had been asked to just take a look and make sure everything was in order before an upcoming appointment. I didn't question why it was my responsibility. I never did. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed a familiar section, emergency contact. My name was there. Full name, phone number, relationship listed simply as family. I paused longer than necessary, not because being listed was new, but because of what it represented. Access, authority, a quiet expectation that if something went wrong, I would be reachable. Responsive. Responsible. I realized, in that moment, how asymmetrical the arrangement was. I was trusted with emergencies, but not included in everyday decisions. Trusted to respond under pressure, but not trusted with influence. My presence mattered most when things went wrong. That realization landed differently than the others. It didn't sting. It clarified. I thought about how rarely anyone checked whether I wanted that responsibility. How it was assumed rather than requested. How my number sat on multiple forms, across multiple contexts, without any conversation about boundaries. I wasn't angry, I was awake. I imagined my phone ringing in the middle of the night. Me answering without hesitation. Me dropping everything, because that's what I do. And I wondered, for the first time, whether that reflex was loyalty or conditioning. I set the papers down and leaned back in my chair. Nothing external changed in that moment. No calls came in. No messages arrived. The world kept moving exactly as it had before. But internally, something clicked into place. I understood then that my silence hadn't been neutral. It had been an active ingredient. By never objecting, I had made it easy for others to lean harder. By being endlessly available, I had removed any reason for them to consider my limits. That wasn't a moral failure. It was a pattern. One, I had the power to interrupt. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even change my behavior right away. I just stopped telling myself the story that this was inevitable. I began to see choice where I'd previously seen obligation. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I picked up my planner, the worn leather one I'd carried for years, and flipped to a blank page. Not to write a list, not to make a plan, just to note a single sentence in my own handwriting. Availability is not the same as consent. That sentence stayed with me. Quiet, unassuming, but solid. That day didn't end with fireworks. It ended with dishes in the sink and an early night. But it marked the moment I stopped waiting for things to balance themselves. Because balance doesn't happen on its own. It happens when someone decides to stop compensating. After that day at the kitchen table, nothing in my outward behavior shifted in a way anyone could point to. There was no announcement, no boundary-setting speech, no emotional withdrawal that might have alerted people that something was different. That was intentional. For most of my life, my silence had been instinctive, automatic. A conditioned response shaped by years of learning that being easy was safer than being honest. I had learned, slowly, unconsciously, that quietness kept things smooth, that not asking too much preserved harmony, that needs could be deferred indefinitely without consequence. But now, silence meant something else. Now it was a decision. I still answered messages, but not instantly. I still helped, but only when asked directly. I still listened, but I stopped translating other people's discomfort into my responsibility. The difference was subtle enough that no one commented on it, which, in itself, was revealing. I stopped anticipating. That was the first change. Before, I lived half a step ahead of everyone else, mentally filling in blanks, predicting needs, preventing problems before they surfaced. It felt like competence. It felt like care. But it was also exhausting. Now, when information was missing, I let it stay missing. When someone hinted instead of asking, I didn't rush to decode the hint. When plans were vaguely mentioned, I didn't follow up to clarify them. When confusion lingered, I allowed it to exist. Not out of spite, out of curiosity. I wanted to see what happened when I didn't compensate. What happened was almost nothing. At least, not at first. People didn't suddenly step up. They didn't check in. They didn't ask if I was okay or if something had changed. Instead, they adjusted around the absence of my overfunctioning as if it were weather. Unfortunate, but manageable. Assumptions filled the space where communication could have been. She's probably busy. She'll get back to us. She usually handles that. That last one lingered. I noticed how long that assumption lived on, even when I was no longer feeding it. And I noticed something else too. How often my previous silence had been interpreted not as thoughtfulness, but as consent. Now that I wasn't smoothing everything over, small frictions appeared. Deadlines were missed. Details were forgotten. Plans became less polished. Still, no one asked why. That was when it became painfully clear. My presence had been structural, not relational. I wasn't missed. I was accounted for. There's a difference. I paid attention to how rarely anyone reached out without needing something. How conversations, once I stopped carrying them, shortened. How quickly I faded from the center of logistical awareness when I stopped reinforcing my role. At first, it triggered old instincts. A familiar urge to jump back in, to fix, to remind people I was here, capable, willing. I had to sit with that discomfort deliberately. I reminded myself that stepping back wasn't abandonment. It was information gathering, and the information was sobering. I realized how often my earlier involvement had prevented others from experiencing consequences. Minor ones, but instructive ones. I had been a buffer, a shock absorber, a system designed to ensure nothing ever fell apart badly enough to require change. Without that buffer, inefficiencies surfaced, and instead of addressing them, people worked around them. I wasn't punished for my silence, I was bypassed. That stung in a way I hadn't anticipated, because a small, naive part of me had believed that if I pulled back, someone might notice, might ask, might say, "Hey, you've been quiet, everything okay?" That didn't happen. Silence, when you've trained people to rely on it, doesn't create concern. It creates inconvenience. And inconvenience is often managed, not investigated. I began to see how invisible my labor had been precisely because it had been consistent. How people had grown accustomed to outcomes without ever tracing them back to effort. There was no malice in it, just habituation. And habituation is powerful. I started documenting things then. Not obsessively, not emotionally. Just factually. Dates, forms, conversations. Who was listed where? Who assumed what? Who reached out only after something went wrong? This wasn't preparation for revenge. It was preparation for clarity. For years, I had minimized my own perceptions, told myself I was overreacting, too sensitive, reading too much into harmless behavior. Now I wanted evidence, not to use against anyone, but to anchor myself in reality. Because once you stop overgiving, people's patterns become impossible to ignore. I noticed how rarely decisions were communicated before they were finalized. How often I was informed after the fact, framed as a courtesy rather than inclusion. How my opinions were solicited only when a solution was needed, not when direction was being set. And still I said nothing, not because I was afraid, but because I was learning. Silence had become a lens, and through that lens, I saw how much of my value, in their eyes, was tied to my utility rather than my presence. How quickly relational closeness dissolved when I stopped acting as infrastructure. That knowledge didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I became more selective with my energy, more intentional with my responses, less apologetic for delays that didn't require apologies. I didn't explain myself. Explanations invite negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. I was recalibrating. And in that recalibration, something steadied inside me. A sense of self that wasn't contingent on being needed. A quiet confidence that came from knowing I could step back without collapsing. Silence, chosen consciously, is not weakness. It's a restraint. And restraint, when sustained, has a way of revealing exactly what and who has been resting on you all along. What they never noticed wasn't some dramatic transformation. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't disappear. I didn't suddenly become cold or unreachable. What they never noticed was how much space I created. Because when you stop filling every gap, the gaps don't announce themselves. They just sit there, quiet, unclaimed, until someone trips over them. And most people don't look down. They look around for someone else to blame. I moved through my days with a different kind of attentiveness. Not hypervigilance, clarity. I began to see how much of my previous involvement had been invisible scaffolding, the kind no one thinks about until it's gone. I watched deadlines pass without reminders. I watched documents circulate half-complete. I watched conversations loop endlessly because no one synthesized them into decisions. And still, no one connected those moments back to me. Not because they were ungrateful, but because they had never consciously registered the labor in the first place. That's the thing about quiet competence. It trains people not to see it. I kept my planner close, not out of anxiety, but out of habit refined into intention. I wrote things down the way an archivist does. Neutral, accurate, no commentary. Dates when I was listed as a contact. Instances where assumptions were made on my behalf. Times I was informed instead of consulted. Moments where urgency appeared only after neglect. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped explaining them away. I noticed how often my name appeared on forms I'd never seen. Medical, administrative, emergency-related. Each one was an unspoken vote of confidence, paired with an equally unspoken dismissal of my agency. No one asked if I consented. They assumed. And assumption, repeated long enough, becomes entitlement without ever using the word. I didn't correct it right away. Correction would have required emotional labor, justification, and reassurance. It would have reopened conversations I wasn't ready to have. Instead, I prepared. Preparation isn't dramatic. It's quiet, methodical, and deeply uninteresting to anyone not paying attention. I reviewed policies. I reread documents I'd signed years ago without thinking. I learned what emergency contact actually meant in institutional terms, not emotionally, but legally. Procedurally. I learned what authority it did not grant. I learned what obligations were implied and which ones were not. Most importantly, I learned how easily systems default to the most reliable person without ever checking if reliability is still available. I didn't announce this learning. Knowledge doesn't need an audience. I also paid attention to tone, to language, to how often people reached out with certainty instead of curiosity. You'll handle, we put you down as. Those phrases appeared again and again. Casual, confident, unquestioned. What struck me most was how little anyone noticed my internal shift. Not because they were careless, but because they were comfortable. Comfort dulls perception. As long as things more or less worked, no one felt the need to look closer. And things did work, until they didn't. I began to understand that the power I had never came from confrontation. It came from a position. From being embedded so deeply in the functioning of things that my withdrawal, even partial, would register eventually, just not immediately. And that delay mattered, because it gave me time. Time to stop reacting. Time to stop feeling guilty for not rescuing situations that weren't mine to save. Time to disentangle my sense of worth from my usefulness. I wasn't plotting anything. I wasn't waiting for a collapse. I was aligning myself with reality, with what I could give freely, and what I no longer could. What they never noticed was that I was changing. It was that I had already changed. And by the time the consequences began to surface, the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming was already too wide to cross casually. The reveal wasn't cinematic. There was no gasp, no sudden rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. It arrived the way most truths do when you're finally ready to see them. Quietly, almost inconveniently, in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable moment. I was reviewing paperwork again. Not because there was a crisis, but because I had made it a habit to understand the systems I was part of instead of assuming they were benign. This time I wasn't skimming. I was reading line by line. That's when I saw it clearly. How much responsibility had been placed on me by default, and how little reciprocal authority came with it. My name appeared in multiple places, across contexts, carrying weight in emergencies but offering me no voice in prevention. I was expected to respond, not to decide. That was the reveal. Being listed as an emergency contact wasn't an honor. It was a convenience, a way to outsource urgency without redistributing care. Institutions didn't see me as family. They saw me as reachable. And my family, consciously or not, had leaned into that distinction. I noticed something else too, something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. There was no contingency plan without me. No second number, no backup, no conversation about what would happen if I didn't answer. My reliability had replaced redundancy. That's not trust. That's dependence. And dependence, when unexamined, turns brittle. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt clear. Clarity doesn't come with adrenaline. It comes with stillness. I understood then that my leverage wasn't emotional. It wasn't confrontational. It was structural. It existed because I was positioned at the intersection of habit and necessity. And I had never claimed it, because I had never wanted power. I had wanted harmony. But harmony built on one person's endless availability isn't harmony at all. It's an imbalance with good manners. I sat with that realization longer than I expected to. Not to dramatize it, but to let it settle without rushing to action. Old versions of me would have immediately tried to fix the imbalance for everyone else. This time I didn't. I asked myself a different question. What happens if I do nothing? Not as avoidance, but as an experiment. I imagined the phone ringing, the expectation, the assumption that I would pick up because I always had. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine not answering. Not out of spite, not as punishment, but because availability is a choice, not a moral obligation. That thought didn't feel rebellious. It felt honest. The private reveal wasn't that I held power. It was that I had been giving it away quietly for years. And once you realize that, you don't rush to take it back. You wait. You position yourself. You let reality do what it does when support structures change. Because the truth doesn't need to be announced. It only needs to be allowed to surface. There's a moment that comes after clarity, before action. A narrow space where nothing has happened yet, but everything could. That's where I was. I knew enough now to see the shape of the situation without flinching. I understood the mechanics. I understood my position. And I understood that whatever I chose next would quietly set things in motion, without allowing for easy reversal. I had options. I could speak up, call a family meeting, explain how I felt, ask to be removed from certain responsibilities, request boundaries, renegotiate roles, and hope for understanding. That path would have been emotionally honest. It would have required me to educate people who had benefited from not knowing. It would have invited debate, reassurance, and promises that might or might not hold once the urgency faded. I could also continue as I was, aware now, but still compliant. Accept the role with open eyes. Stop expecting reciprocity. Treat it as a one-way responsibility and find meaning elsewhere. That path would have preserved stability. It would have required me to numb something essential in myself. Or I could do nothing visible at all. I could let my behavior speak without explanation. Let systems encounter my absence organically. Allow people to experience the consequences of their assumptions without framing them as accusations. That third option was the quietest and the most irreversible. Once you stop intervening, patterns don't bounce back easily. Once you withdraw invisible labor, people can't unsee its absence, even if they don't name it. I weighed the ethics of that choice carefully. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't hoping for regret or panic. I didn't want an apology extracted under pressure. What I wanted was alignment. I wanted my actions to match my truth without requiring permission. So I decided this. I would not remove myself preemptively. I would not confront or announce. I would simply stop consenting by default. If someone asked me directly, I would answer honestly. If someone assumed, I would let the assumption stand until it met reality. This wasn't passive-aggressive, it was precise. It meant accepting that things might go wrong, that discomfort might surface, that my absence would be felt in ways that weren't flattering to anyone, including me. It meant trusting that I didn't need to manage outcomes to justify boundaries. The moment I chose that path, something settled in me. Not relief, resolve. Because some decisions don't feel empowering in the moment. They feel heavy. They feel adult. They feel like stepping out of a role without knowing what will replace it. I didn't know when the consequences would begin. I didn't know what form they would take. I only knew this. Once I stopped propping things up, whatever remained would be real. And real is the only ground worth standing on. After I made the decision, nothing snapped. There was no emotional release, no sense of victory, no rush of freedom. What came instead was a kind of quiet gravity, as if I had stepped into a different current moving beneath the same surface. Life didn't speed up, it slowed down, not noticeably to anyone else. Just enough for me to feel the difference. Moving in silence isn't about disappearing. It's about precision. About acting without announcing, adjusting without defending, choosing restraint over reaction. I became deliberate in ways I hadn't been before. The first thing I changed wasn't my availability. It was access. I didn't block anyone. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I simply stopped being the automatic conduit. When information was sent to me for safekeeping, I asked, calmly, who else had it? When someone said, "We put you down as the contact," I replied, evenly. I wasn't consulted about that. And then I stopped talking. I didn't rush to solve the discomfort that followed. I noticed how often people relied on me to translate between institutions and family, between urgency and follow-through. Medical language, administrative processes, and timelines required attention and patience. I had always stepped into that role without hesitation. It felt natural, responsible. Now I paused. If someone asked directly, I answered. If they hinted, I didn't fill in the blanks. If confusion lingered, I allowed it to linger. Not to make a point, but because clarity doesn't need rescuing. I reviewed the paperwork with a different lens. Not emotional, procedural. I learned exactly what being listed as an emergency contact did and did not require of me. Where responsibility ended, where assumptions began. In places where I had legitimate authority, I made quiet corrections. In places where I didn't, I let the record stand. I stopped smoothing institutional friction. I stopped chasing down confirmations that weren't my obligation. I stopped reminding people of deadlines that weren't mine to track. The financial shifts were subtle but significant. I no longer fronted costs just to keep things moving. I waited for approvals. I let reimbursements be delayed because they weren't mine to absorb. Before, I had treated delays as personal inconveniences to be solved. Now, I treated them as information. And the information was clear. My flexibility had been subsidizing other people's disorganization. I kept my tone unchanged. That was important. I didn't become colder. I didn't become distant. If anything, I became more neutral, more professional. Politeness without pliability. I didn't want anyone to mistake my restraint for emotional punishment. This wasn't withdrawal. It was a recalibration. I stopped being the person who remembered everything for everyone else. Appointments went unconfirmed. Forms were partially filled. Conversations stalled because no one synthesized them into action. Nothing collapsed. But nothing flowed as smoothly either. And still, no one asked me why. Instead, I noticed mild confusion ripple outward. Not directed at me, but at the situation itself. That's strange. I thought this was handled. Didn't someone take care of that? They were circling the absence without naming it. What struck me most during this time was how long the assumption of my involvement lingered. Even after I had stepped back, people spoke as if I were still quietly managing things behind the scenes. My silence didn't immediately register as change. It registered as a delay. And delay is tolerated far longer than absence. Moving in silence requires patience, because the instinct to explain, to soften the transition, to reassure people that you're still good, still cooperative, is powerful. I felt it often. There were moments when stepping back felt uncomfortable, even wrong. Moments when I wondered if I was being unfair, if I were abandoning people who didn't realize they were leaning so heavily. I had to remind myself, boundaries don't require consensus to be valid. I wasn't creating hardship. I was revealing dependency. And dependency, once visible, demands adjustment from everyone involved. I didn't watch for reactions. I didn't wait for acknowledgement. I stayed focused on alignment, on making sure my actions matched what I was now aware of. I had spent years cushioning outcomes. Now I was allowing reality to move at its natural pace, quietly, unassisted. And though no one said anything yet, I could feel the system straining. Not breaking, just noticing. That was enough. Consequences rarely arrive with drama. They don't announce themselves. They surface as confusion first. Small, almost forgettable disruptions that people assume will resolve on their own. At least, that's how it started. A form wasn't submitted on time. An appointment had to be rescheduled. Someone realized, too late, that a document had expired. None of it was catastrophic, just inconvenient. I noticed how quickly frustration appeared, and how instinctively it reached outward. Why didn't anyone catch this? I thought this was already taken care of. How did this slip through? The language was telling, passive, abstract, no subject. No one named responsibility, because responsibility had always been implied, not assigned. I stayed quiet, not out of indifference, out of discipline. I answered questions when they were asked directly. I clarified facts when accuracy mattered. But I didn't step in to absorb the emotional fallout. I didn't apologize for outcomes I hadn't caused. For the first time, people had to sit with the consequences of assuming instead of confirming. And it made them uncomfortable. I began to sense a subtle shift in tone. Messages became more urgent. Requests are more explicit. The casual confidence that had once accompanied "Ruby will handle it" began to fray. Still, no one acknowledged the pattern. Instead, I felt the weight of expectation hovering, waiting for me to resume my role, to stabilize things, to make it all disappear. I didn't, and that's when the confusion edged closer to anxiety. People started double-checking, following up, rereading threads. Not because they had changed, but because the system no longer compensated for inattention. I watched this happen without commentary. Not because I was detached, but because intervening would have erased the information the moment was providing. I learned something important then. People don't feel loss immediately when support disappears. They feel inefficiency. And inefficiency demands effort. Effort, when newly required, feels like injustice. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. The consequences weren't personal yet, but they were cumulative. And momentum, once lost, is hard to regain quietly. By the time anyone realized something was genuinely wrong, the window for easy correction had already closed. That's how these things usually go. People assume there will be time later. A chance to clarify. An opportunity to smooth things over once the urgency passes. But urgency doesn't pass when it's been neglected for too long. It compounds. The first real panic didn't come with shouting. It came with a different kind of message. Shorter, sharper, stripped of pleasantries. Do you know what's going on with this? Can you call me as soon as you see this? Something's not right. I read those messages calmly. Not with satisfaction, with recognition. This was the moment people finally noticed the absence. Not as an inconvenience, but as a risk. I responded carefully. Factually. I shared what I knew. I didn't speculate. I didn't reassure beyond what was true. And that's when I felt the shift. They weren't asking me to help anymore. They were asking me to save something. The tone had changed from assumption to urgency, from confidence to concern. The system they had relied on without acknowledging was no longer quietly compensating. And now the gaps mattered. I could hear it in their voices when we spoke. The hesitation, the recalibration, the subtle question beneath the surface. Why aren't you fixing this? They didn't ask it out loud. They didn't have to. For the first time, I saw how deeply my earlier silence had shaped expectations. How my reliability had become an emotional safety net. One no one realized they were standing on until it wasn't there. People scrambled. Calls were made. Options were explored that had never been considered because they hadn't been necessary before. The word "too late" surfaced, not as an accusation, but as a realization. Deadlines had passed. Policies were fixed. Institutions moved on their own timelines, indifferent to family dynamics or intentions. I watched all of this unfold with a steady heart. Not because I didn't care, but because caring doesn't always mean intervening. There was a moment, a quiet one, when someone said, almost to themselves, "We should have checked sooner." They didn't say my name. They didn't need to. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I would get. And it was enough, because by then, the truth was unavoidable. What had been lost wasn't just time or options. It was the illusion that things would always work out simply because I was there. Once that illusion broke, there was no way to glue it back together without addressing the imbalance that created it. And no one was ready to do that yet. The confrontation didn't look the way people imagine confrontations should. There was no raised voice, no trembling hands, no dramatic pause where everything spilled out at once. It happened quietly, almost gently. Someone finally asked to talk. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in confusion. The kind that comes when patterns stop working, and no one knows why. We sat across from each other, neutral ground. No audience, no urgency left to weaponize. They spoke first. "I don't understand how things got this far," they said. "You've always handled this kind of stuff." There it was. Not blame, not an apology, just expectation. Spoken aloud for the first time. I didn't interrupt. I let the sentence sit between us long enough for its weight to be felt. Then I replied calmly, evenly. "I handled it because no one else did," I said. Not because it was assigned, and not because I agreed to do it forever. My voice didn't shake. That surprised both of us. They looked at me differently then, not defensively, but with something like recalibration. As if they were trying to locate me on a map that had just changed scale. "I didn't know you felt that way," they said. "I know," I replied, "and because no one asked." That was it. No monologue, no list of grievances, no need to prove my exhaustion or justify my boundaries. I wasn't asking for an apology. I wasn't negotiating a new arrangement. I was stating reality. I explained, briefly, how assumptions had replaced communication. How being reliable had quietly turned into being defaulted to. How emergencies had been outsourced without conversations about consent or capacity. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't talk about hurt. I talked about structure. They listened. Not perfectly, but sincerely. There was a pause, then a question carefully phrased. "So, what happens now?" I answered just as carefully. "Now," I said, Things are assigned, or they're shared, or they're handled differently, but they're not silently placed on one person anymore. No threat, no ultimatum, just a boundary, clearly drawn. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. No promises, no declarations of change. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, my role wasn't assumed. It was acknowledged, and that was enough to walk away without heat, without resentment, without needing the last word. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. It's not a hardened version of who I used to be, or a colder one. I didn't swing to the opposite extreme. I didn't become unreachable or indifferent. It became clear. Clarity changes how you move through the world. It strips away the need to perform roles you never consciously chose. It quiets the impulse to prove your value through endurance. I still care. That never left. But care is no longer something I offer by default. It's something I give intentionally, where it's reciprocated and respected. I no longer confuse usefulness with belonging. There's a steadiness in that distinction, a groundedness I didn't know I was missing until it arrived. Now, when someone reaches out, I listen for the shape of the request. Is it shared responsibility or silent delegation? Is it an invitation or an expectation disguised as politeness? If it's the latter, I don't rush to soften it. I let it stand as it is. I've learned that saying less doesn't make you smaller. Often, it makes you more visible. When you stop filling every silence, people have to confront what they're actually asking of you. Some relationships adjusted, some didn't. The ones that lasted became more honest, more balanced, less dependent on my emotional labor to function. Those conversations are quieter now, but deeper. And the ones that faded? They weren't built on presence to begin with. They were built on access. Letting that go wasn't painful the way I feared it would be. It was relieving. I still carry my planner, but it's lighter now. Fewer tabs. Fewer obligations exist only because I never question them. The pages are more intentional, written for my life, not everyone else's emergencies. I don't wait to be noticed anymore. I don't measure my worth by how much I absorb without complaint. I trust myself to know when something is mine to carry, and when it isn't. And perhaps the most important change is this. I no longer explain myself to earn understanding. I state what's true, and I allow others to respond however they will. That's not detachment. That's self-respect. I didn't lose my place. I chose a different one. There's a quiet lesson buried in stories like this, and it has nothing to do with blame. No one in my life woke up one day intending to erase me. No one planned to lean so heavily without asking. What happened grew slowly, through habit, convenience, and my own willingness to carry more than I should have. That's how imbalance usually forms. Not through cruelty, but through silence that goes unexamined. For a long time, I believed that being strong meant being endlessly accommodating. That maturity meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. That love looked like availability without limits. I don't believe that anymore. What I've learned is this. Boundaries don't destroy relationships. Assumptions do. When people are allowed to assume access indefinitely, they stop seeing the person behind the function. Being the reliable one can feel like a virtue until reliability becomes a role you're trapped inside. Until emergencies matter more than everyday respect. Until you're trusted with crises but excluded from care. And here's the part that's uncomfortable, but honest. Silence teaches people how to treat you. Not maliciously, but effectively. What you absorb without objection becomes part of the structure. What you fix quietly becomes invisible. Change doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires restraint. A willingness to let small consequences surface so larger truths can be seen. I didn't leave. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't demand apologies. I simply stopped consenting to a role that was costing me more than it gave. And when the hospital called anyway, because systems don't recognize emotional shortcuts, that was the moment reality cut through every assumption. Not with drama, with finality. If this story resonates with you, maybe it's because you recognize parts of yourself in it. Maybe you're the one people rely on without checking in. Maybe you've been praised for being easy when what you really were was silent. So I'll leave you with this, not as advice, but as an invitation to reflect. Where in your life have you been carrying responsibility that was never consciously chosen? And what might change if you paused long enough to notice? If you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.